Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. I'm your host, Cody Cook, and we have Glen Scrivener with us today to talk about his book, The Air We Breathe, which also recently was a selection of the Libertarian Christian Book Club. Glen is an ordained Church of England minister and evangelist who preaches Christ through writing, speaking, and online media. He directs the evangelistic ministry Speak Life. Glen is originally from Australia, and now he and his wife, Emma, live with their 2 children in England. Glen, thanks for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Cody.
Yeah, well, but before we start talking about the book, can you tell us a little bit about Speak Life and what makes it special?
Sure. We are a Christian ministry that helps Christians to evangelize their friends. And so we have a bunch of different resources to do that. We've got a podcast called the Speak Life Podcast. We're on YouTube quite a lot, reaching out there. We are the Speak Life channel there, and books, writing, and probably the number one resource that I think might help your listeners is 321course.com. It's just an online kind of, it's a mere Christianity for a digital age. And we hope that people can really encounter Christ and pass him on through 8 really shareable kind of videos that people can be led through on that video course.
And actually, so repeat the name of the video course again, because you broke up there, and it might just be something that will be resolved by the time the recording's done, but I just want to make sure people hear it.
Sure. It's 321 course, and people can go to 321course.com.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. So the main thing that I kind of wanted to talk to you about was a book that you wrote called The Air We Breathe, which we recently did a book club about, the Libertarian Christian Institute. And in it, you highlight the ways in which Christianity has shaped the way we think about the world and morality, ways which we often fail to notice because they're so ingrained in the fabric of what it means to be a Western person. It's like the air we breathe, right? So, for instance, you argue that the political and moral debates that we have in the West are largely about which part of Jesus's ethic you emphasize. That right and left, in a lot of cases, are sort of just kind of picking a part of that New Testament ethic and sort of really hitting on it. So, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, we're hurling Bible verses at each other. We've just forgotten the references. That's kind of one of the lines that I use. And I think our moral sensibilities have been shaped by Jesus in ways that are so pervasive that we don't end up noticing them. And that's true whether people are Christians or not. And one of the ways that you can realize that is if you think of all the negative adjectives that people would kind of throw at the church as critiques. People would tend to think of the church as unequal, cruel, coercive, unenlightened, anti-science, restrictive, and regressive. But I haven't actually grabbed those 7 adjectives at random. I've just reversed the 7 values that I talk about in the book. The 7 values that I talk about that Christianity has kind of taught us in the West through history has been equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress. And so what do you notice is that everybody kind of tends to tick off all 7 of those and say yay and amen to them, whether they're a Christian or not. And people tend to think that if you get the reverse of those, then you are dealing with something really quite profoundly wrong. But if it's wrong with a capital W, what is it that's right with a capital R? And the thesis of the book is, well, it's Christianity in the form that the West has kind of received that gospel down through the centuries.
Yeah, and what's kind of interesting, I mean, this is, I don't want to take us into too much philosophical speculation here so quickly, but a lot of challenges to Christianity in recent years have more or less come from the progressive left. But as you point out, those values like the dignity and the value of each human being, those are Christian values, and the left is sort of seeking to attack and undermine those values by undermining Christianity, even as they're trying to establish them. But in my opinion, I mean, the strongest challenges to Christianity are the ones that really try to lay the axe at the foundations. So you reference Nietzsche in the book, but this like Nietzschean notion of the will to power is really, I think, it takes Christianity's upside down concern for the weak and says, well, that's actually anti-human, right? That and it's really very, kind of Roman in its first century context. So, I mean, how do you feel like Christianity can challenge that point of view? Because I feel like, as you said, if you're arguing with the progressive, we're sort of arguing from the same foundation, but somebody who is like a Nietzschean is going to be someone who's really, I think, going to challenge Christianity at its core.
Yeah, I think they are, and I think they are harder to deal with in terms of trying to evangelize or just trying to find common ground. But I guess, I mean, Nietzsche still had a huge value for the human. He thought that, history's nausea, another way of referring to Christianity, history's nausea had sickened humanity and made us weak, and had made us not only weak, but made us perversely lift up the weak, as though that was a strength, as though that was valor. But he did want a kind of vitalism himself. He did have a place for the human, and profoundly, what he wanted to do was release humans from the stultifying kind of clasping ideology of Christianity, in order that humans could be truly vital. But maybe there's a way with a modern Nietzschean of actually saying, look, if you want an actual place for the human, you cannot go past God the human. You could not have a higher value for human beings than God the Son becoming God our brother, and rising to the right hand of the Father. I think there's something perhaps that you could get to with a Nietzschean about prizing the human in that way. But you're right. It's a much harder task to call them to the ethic of the cross than it is for someone who instinctively wants to lift up the weak and the marginalized and the vulnerable. That's very much what those on the progressive left want to do. It's something that Nietzsche himself would find disgusting.
Yeah, I mean, Nietzsche, if I recall correctly, in the Antichrist, he says that the right kind of charity is to let the weak perish.
Right.
And so you compare that to, I mean, that sentiment would have been very much at home in the way that ancient pagans mocked the idea of a crucified God. So you referenced the early depiction of Jesus on what do you call it?
The graffiti, the Alexa,
kind of written on those graffiti.
Yeah. The Alexamenos graffiti.
Where Jesus is presented as an ass, right? And so as you say in the book, a man on a cross is not a god; he's an ass. At least in that ancient perspective, back before this idea that the weak actually had some place in God's kingdom. So, but there is something there in that. I think you could take that to another extreme, perhaps. That there's the Nietzschean extreme on the one end, but is there a sense in which saying, the weak and the poor are on the top, and the rich and the powerful are on the bottom? Does that lead us into inevitably into Marxism, or are there other counterbalances? Are there other Christian values that balance that out a little bit?
Yeah, well, I think certainly Marxism is unthinkable without the Christian Revolution, and for as much as Marx wanted a revolution against Christianity, and for as much as he wanted to replace the church with the state, nevertheless, I think a lot of the contours of his ideology make sense precisely as that move. Let's completely horizontalize Christianity. The last shall be first. But let us make history into the great judge of that, rather than God, and let us turn the state into the great, redistributive arm, rather than the church. And in a lot of ways, you can see kind of Marxism as, in one sense, a perverted, secularized book of Acts, right? Where, in both Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4, and later on in the book, whoever had property would sell it and put the money at the apostles' feet, and then whoever had need would be catered for, and that kind of thing. It's the kingdom of God without the king in lots of different ways, but also without many of the safeguards of the sense of the individual and the sense of human rights that Christianity has also given to us. And so, absolutely, Marxism is one Christian heresy, if you like. In lots of ways, I think that's what we're dealing with in modern Western culture. We can't really escape from the influence of Christianity, and even when you try to be as radical an opponent of Christianity as Marx, you cannot help but do so with some pretty Christian-ish assumptions in your back pocket somewhere.
That's good. No, I love what you said about Marxism being a Christian heresy. I'm going to hold on to that and probably use that somewhere. But, so before we maybe kind of dig deep into these values that you speak about as Christian values that we value in the West, that we value. So I just maybe kind of just to get a little more meta still, this idea of Christianity shaping the West. Like I'm personally really glad that these values have shaped the West. But maybe this is a heresy on the other side. I'm also very opposed to theocracy. So is there a tension there? So, some people talk about, Christianity did all these things for the West, and thus we should create a Christian state, that we should sort of just go fully into that idea. And so not just having Christianity shape culture, but also really having this sort of Christian collusion with political power. Does your thesis lead logically to Christian nationalism, or is there an exit strategy before you get to there?
Well, I mean, Christian nationalism means very different things on different sides of the pond. I think. I think in the Church of England, like I'm a minister in the Church of England. In one sense, my line manager is the king. So he's the governor of the Church of England. There are bishops in the upper house of our parliament, the House of Lords. It's an unelected house. Bishops sit there by right. Every square inch of this country in England is covered by the parish system, and the Church of England kind of plays chaplain to the entire nation in a way that just, America was not set up like that, very deliberately so. So is the UK a Christian nation? Well, yeah, like pretty obviously, it's pretty obviously a Christian nation. Now that's probably not the scary thing that many people on the left in the States are worried about. Like when they're worried about Christian nationalism in the States, they don't imagine, it'll become like the Anglican Church in England. And probably what a lot of people are agitating for as Christian nationalists in the US. They're probably not agitating for the Church of England. They probably have a different ecclesiology, and America is just a very different country with a different history to it and a different racial past to it. And there are all sorts of complicating factors about why Christian nationalism in the States is a very different beast to anything that might be true in Europe. But I do think it's worth pointing out that so many of the ideals and the principles that are loved by libertarians in the US came out of Christendom. And so much of the language of the individual, for instance, it wasn't really post-Enlightenment reasoning that got us to the individuals. Certainly that emphasized and heightened certain trends that had been happening. But I think Larry Seidentop, the political philosopher, is absolutely right to say that what had invented the individual happened a lot earlier than John Locke or John Stuart Mill or Rousseau or any thinker from the Enlightenment. I think it's been Trinitarian reflection on the persons of God. I think it has been Christological reflection on what it is for Christ to have a human nature. I think in the political sphere, it was reflection upon human rights, and do humans have rights as such, and does the human simply by virtue of being a human have that shield against the state and against the collective? These were all things that were kind of hammered out long before there was an Enlightenment, and certainly long before 1776. So before you get too scared about Christendom, at least recognize that whether or not Christendom is in your future or not, the fact that it has been in your past, I think you should be glad of, And I think it has delivered to you much of your philosophy of the individual that your libertarianism depends upon.
No, that's good. That's good. I like that. Yeah, and it would take us too far afield to talk about those Trinitarian discussions that led us to personhood. But it is a really fascinating area of research. I mean, the Latin persona, which we derive person from, referred to a mask that an actor wore on a stage, and it really reflects this idea that persons aren't really differentiated in the ancient world. They're sort of just
Right.
Instances of that kind of background stuff that makes up the universe. And so once they start to have to differentiate the Father from the Son and the Holy Spirit, they say, okay, well, what does that mean for the Father to be a different persona than the Son? And they want to really, I think, argue that they're different persons. And so that, that philosophy develops from that conversation, which is totally fascinating.
Yes.
But yeah, well, I think one thing I got out of your response is that maybe a word of warning to the Christian nationalists that if you get your way, America might become like England.
Make America Great Britain again. Yeah.
There you go. Okay, so maybe to go down a little bit deeper into these values. So you write about how Christianity changed the conversation about the value of compassion, for starters. Christians established hospitals. They ended the gladiatorial games. They fought infanticide, not with law, but with love, adopting babies left out to be exposed, raising them as their own. And that last point is interesting to me because in America, the Christian answer to abortion tends to emphasize legal channels, not entirely, but that's, there's plenty of Christian ministries and churches that offer resources to pregnant women in crisis. But I mean, do you feel like the early church provides a better model of leading with love instead of law, or is the right approach a synthesis? Is that just because they didn't have any other option, or is that love instead of law approach kind of rooted in their theology?
Well, I think it was rooted in historical contingencies to some degree. When you are a weak minority, absolutely being persecuted by Caesar, law is not an option for you in order to reform the empire. Love is all you got. But once 312 happened, and once Constantine converted, and once there were Christian emperors, law really did come in as a complement, I think, to many of the reforms that Christians made. And so absolutely Christians, as a movement of love, would collect infants that had been left exposed on rubbish dumps, left to people traffickers or left to die. They would collect them and raise them, and they pioneered a different kind of orphan care, a different kind of family in lots of ways, as a movement of love. But then when they were in a position to legislate, they did outlaw exposition, like exposing your children. They did make it a law that you had to raise your own offspring. And so there was a kind of a 1-2 punch in the social reforms that happened. They led with love, absolutely. But, law, interestingly, also teaches, and they taught the kind of society that they wanted to have through their laws as well. You might run a similar argument with gladiatorial games. I mean, Christians were opposed to the gladiatorial games. They would not show up at the gladiatorial games. And so they boycotted them. And then Telemachus, famously in about 400 AD, he went into the arena to sort of stand between two dueling gladiators and said, "Stop, stop." And then he himself was stoned to death by the crowd, who had not come to see a monk protest. They'd come to see the blood. And blood they got, and they got Telemachus's blood. But then the story is told that word of his martyrdom reached the ears of the emperor, and that loving martyrdom and self-sacrificial individual acts by one monk was important, but also the legislation of the emperor was important as well. And eventually the gladiatorial games were banned, and it did take legislation for that to happen. So I completely see the way in which love led the way. But I think we should also be aware of the way that legislation followed up as well.
Okay, fair response. Okay, so let's focus maybe a little bit on moving into the Middle Ages just a bit. So the Middle Ages are known to be a time of Christendom propagating itself by force. That's at least the stereotype. But you point out that there's also a rich stream of Christianity, which was exemplified by Boniface over and against Emperor Charlemagne, which taught peaceful persuasion instead of coercion. So as a libertarian, and also in my case as an Anabaptist, this made my ears prick up, because that's what we're all about. And I think that most modern Christians would agree that persuasion is better than coercion. But I don't necessarily always see a consistent proclamation of the initiation of force as immoral inherently. Is this a way in which the world has partially conquered Christianity and not vice versa, that we like persuasion, but we're fine with some coercion?
Yeah, and it's a very mixed report in the Middle Ages. Interestingly, the one lesson I wanted to draw out from the Middle Ages, I tried to draw out a lesson from each kind of epoch in history, about how Christianization kind of affected things. And I think I called that chapter Enlightenment, and partly that was just me thumbing my nose to all the bogus historians who want to call the Middle Ages the Dark Ages. They're not the Dark Ages. There was much enlightenment there, and the age that gave us Chaucer and parliaments and human rights and universities. It's hard to call that dark, isn't it? But the lesson I wanted to draw from that period was the hard-won conviction that we are to forward our ends via persuasion and not by force, by the sword of the Spirit, not by the sword of steel. And certainly Boniface is an example of an evangelist who paid with his own blood in order to bring nonviolent persuasion to the Saxons. And Charlemagne was, up until 800 AD, was very much a man of blood and a man whose swords were all of the steel variety. But he was, persuaded by Alcuin of York that persuasion is the way to actually rule properly as an emperor. And there was the Carolingian reforms. There were this renaissance, really, in terms of learning, and the cathedral schools, eventually kind of burst out of that movement that became the universities and that kind of thing. And again and again, what you see in the Middle Ages is the way of the flesh, which is very much the way of force and self-assertion. But there are prophets again and again of the way of the Spirit, who, during the Crusades, for instance, you would have preachers who would go to the front lines and actually, preach to the troops and try to go over to the Saracen side, try and go over to the Muslim side and preach the gospel to them. And occasionally they actually, returned from those little sorties with their head still on their shoulders, which was remarkable. And so, when you think of the Dark Ages, you will often think of the exceptions to the rule that we should forward our ends via persuasion and not by force. You think of the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, or you think about Galileo being, at a later date, on trial for his thoughts. But I think overall, what the church was learning in those times was that we should forward our ends via gentle means, via persuasion, via reason, and not via force and violence and coercion. And in a sense, I think the exceptions to that rule that we're all probably bringing to mind right now, the reason why those are so prominent in our minds right now, I think, is because of the hard-won intellectual preference for persuasion that the Middle Ages eventually yielded to us.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when talking about the Dark Ages. I mean, it seems like different critics have different reasons for this kind of a narrative of decay in this period, right? And, Protestants don't like it because that was when it was basically Catholicism won out and became sort of the church. And I think secularists don't like it. And I think probably secularists, if I'm not mistaken, sort of more or less invented the term. They don't like it because they see it as a period when Christianity in general was kind of running the show. And, those who are kind of maybe more Anabaptist or libertarian or whatever, what they see, I think, is this kind of period between the early church, which was largely not really interested in the state, and that kind of coercive state-church relationship. And then, the 1,000 years later, you get like the Anabaptists, and so you finally have people starting to say, "Hey, maybe the church shouldn't be connected to the state," and then that view wins out ultimately. But I think your book makes the point that I think even though the Middle Ages were not what we would like them to be from where we are now, there's a lot of light there that God didn't abandon the church during that period. So I think that's a helpful thing to keep in mind. So I'd like to maybe ask a little bit about consent, because that's one of the values that you mentioned that Christianity gave us. So in the ancient world, the status of a sexual object determined the rightness of a sex act. So if someone was a slave, for instance, it was no big deal for an upper class man to rape her or him. Christianity didn't get rid of all distinctions in status as a matter of practicality, but it did argue that all people are ontologically equal. And that changed the dynamics of whether or not we value their humanity and care about their consent. So, as you point out, the first century sexual revolution asked men to exercise as much self-control as women. And the 1960s sexual revolution also emphasized equality, but in the other direction. It argued that women should be just as free sexually as men want to be, equally unrestricted in their sexual pursuits. What do you think has emerged from this change in gears? Presumably you feel like the first century in some sense got it more right than the 1960s did.
I think so. I think there have definitely been gains to the sexual revolution of the 1960s. I think women being able to hold property in their own names and not being considered the property of their own husbands and things like that. The fact that marital rape is on the statute books and it wasn't until the 1970s. I think there are all sorts of ways in which the 1960s had been helpful in terms of bringing the equality of the sexes to the fore again and making us rethink the way we'd been doing things. But overall, I think women and children and men themselves are best served when actually men are told to restrict themselves. That I think unrestrained male libido is a kind of a terrifying force. And one book that really convinced me of that was what's it called? The Weirdest People in the World by Joseph Henrich. So he's an evolutionary biologist from Harvard, not a Christian. And he basically, looks at the majority cultures of the world. The majority cultures of the world are not monogamous matrimony. Like that's not the way most societies have done the male-female thing or the family thing. The marriage and family program of Christianity, Joseph Henrich says, is what has made the West so weird. And by weird, he means an acronym: Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. And actually, all that psychological weirdness and the prosperity of the West as well, he would put down to the fact that men are tamed within Christianity. And they are tied to one woman and to their offspring in a way that biology does not. So biology does not tie a man to his woman. Biology does not tie a man to his offspring. Covenant does that. Marriage does that. And in a society in which there is a strong institution like the church, which in his terms, Joseph Henrich says the church reached down and grabbed men by the testicles. So there's a romantic phrase for what marriage kind of achieves. But this testosterone suppression system, he calls it, is really good for men. It's even better for women, and it's best of all for children. And when we compare that kind of revolution that was brought in the first century with the 1960s revolution, I think we can definitely see that the children have been net losers of that sexual revolution. Marriage was meant to tie men to their women and to their children. And family is the best place for children to grow up. And when those bonds have broken down, I think definitely children have been huge losers from the sexual revolution of the 1960s. I'm not really in a position to say this, but I think Louise Perry, as a feminist, is. But she would say that the sexual revolution of the 1960s has been an absolute net negative for women as well. She wrote the case against the sexual revolution. And just says, look, there is an asymmetry between men and women in terms of their sexual interests and what they're looking for in sex and in relationships, and women are not looking for the same thing that men are looking for. So, therefore, releasing women in the 1960s and saying just be like men hasn't been in the sexual realm for the great blessing of women either. So. Yeah, overall, I'm a Jesus guy, and I think the sexual revolution of the first century has overall been for the greater flourishing of humankind.
So I can hear, in my head, a certain kind of critic, sort of chauvinist, Mark Driscoll type or something, who says, well, you talked about men being tamed. I feel like some people would hear that and think feminized. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And, you talked about, that the sexual revolution said women should be like men. And I think what they would say is that we live in this era now where men are expected to be like women. And so I think of the pagan philosopher Celsus, who argued that Christianity's egalitarian beliefs made it fit for only women and slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And so, a number of men, today with online and preaching platforms seem to argue that, like, for example, the church has become too feminized, and thus it's leaving men behind by not speaking to their concerns. And so my question is, do they have a point? And if so, how can the church reach men without compromising this fundamental concern for ontological equality between the sexes? And maybe as a bonus question, do you feel like Christianity teaches that there are distinct male and female virtues, or are there at bottom really only Christian virtues when we think about biblical Christianity?
Lots of questions in there. Well, I think Andrew Tate should be no one's idea of virtue. Now, interestingly, the Latin word for virtue is just taken from the Latin word for vir, which is man, right? And virtue, certainly in an ancient understanding, was simply manliness, and women were deformed men, right? I mean, Aristotle would just say that women are not properly formed men, right? Deformed men, and I think we're all very glad that we don't think that anymore, and that there is an equality of the sexes. I think I'm also very glad that when you read the virtue lists of the New Testament, you read something like the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5. It's very possible that a Stoic philosopher hearing love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, they might think, oh, that sounds like the ladies' list. Where's the gentleman's list? Where's the true man's list? And it's not like there's faith, hope, and love, but also you might want to round that out with some hunting and barbecuing and belching if you're a man. True men genuinely sacrifice for their women in a way that is so unlike the Andrew Tates of this world. And Andrew Tate is not a man. And Andrew Tate is a parody of what a 7-year-old thinks of as a man. A real man, like, yeah, sure, crushes it at work, and yeah, goes to the gym, but comes home and serves his wife, serves his children in ways that would have been baffling to an ancient Stoic. Would have been absolutely baffling to many people from traditional cultures. And one of the differences I draw attention to is, back in the Middle Ages, right when Genghis Khan was basically seeding more of humanity than any other man ever has. And is that the most manly thing that anyone has ever done? Genghis Khan, rule, conquer, rape, pillage, and reproduce. And so here is a man's man, right? And right at the same time, I think in France and in Northern Europe, you had this sense of chivalry that is developing about what is it to actually to use the strength that a man naturally has, but to use it in the service of those who don't have that strength. What does that look like? It doesn't look simply like being. It doesn't simply look like being Genghis Khan. It doesn't simply look like being a coward either. It looks like being, a knight, right? It looks like being a chivalrous knight who, is winning the fair hand of a maiden, right? Through strength and through valor and through a heck of a lot of courage, fortitude and perseverance and all these great kind of classical virtues that you want to employ, but you employ them for the sake of your woman and for the sake of your children and for the sake of this society, for the sake of those who don't have a sword as big as your sword. And so there's all the place in the world for a masculine Christian, but that masculine Christian doesn't look like Genghis Khan, doesn't look like Andrew Tate. He looks like Jesus. He looks like a servant who uses strength for the sake of others.
Well, what's interesting in that answer, it seems like kind of a moderated answer in some way. I mean, do you feel that there is sort of a point about men being left behind by the way that the church is presenting its virtues and its values, or is there something that we could be doing better there, or do men just need to get with the program? Are we doing fine and men just need to accept the gospel and go with it?
No, I think there's definitely been some female coded language that has gained the ascendancy in the last century or so. And there are theological reasons for that. I think what you get in male and female is the integration of these two modes of being that are analogous to what you get with nature and grace. Nature and grace, in theological terms, what happened, nature is what we have by creation. Grace is what Christ gifts to us as a supernatural donation. And what I think has happened in a lot of the virtues that we have prized, certainly post-war, has been we will privilege grace over nature to the point where, we privilege, gender identity over biology, let's say, right? There's something that has definitely happened in culture. And what you, the individual, chooses has a precedence. It certainly, has done in the culture, has a precedence over the biological fact of my chromosomes. And I think you can see in our culture that there has been a privileging of grace without nature, and men get left behind in that assessment of things commonly, because what of the great strengths of men is their strength, right? Upper body strength and just the fact of masculine power in the world. That is a good thing that has always needed infusing with grace and weaving together with grace. And yeah, has it been the case that in the post-war West, and technology has completely sent this into hyperdrive. You don't need a heck of a lot of strength to have a laptop and just tap away, and therefore, yeah, men have been left behind in that kind of sense. But the answer to that is not to go back to being Genghis.
No, yeah, that's an interesting, a fair answer. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things there. I mean, I think the way that a lot of the work is done in the West now is not really, it's fairly gender neutral, right? There's certain jobs that
Yeah.
are definitely more masculine coded, but there's not really that many places where men in particular can shine. They maybe compete with women on not necessarily women's terms, but on kind of gender neutral terms. And I think a part of what you said there made me think of the kind of existentialist philosophy, the idea that existence precedes essence, that we can sort of determine who we are, and we're not really locked in by by nature or by God's design, that we can sort of just kind of remake and be this new thing. There is, though, I mean, I would say, in one sense, a Christian corollary to that, though, which is that we are, we're born sinners, but we actually have an ability to change that. That there's a sort of the spirit. I think you talked about that spirit versus nature dynamic, but yeah, there's a lot to chew on there, because I think I think I'm very masculine in the sense of being very analytical and liking systems and dealing with systems better than I deal with people. But but I was never one of those go out and hunt and drink beer type guys. So sometimes when I hear some of these men complain, it just doesn't ring personally true to me. But maybe I need to be more sensitive to their own experience on that. But so when I was coming of age, this is just kind of maybe more a meta question again about the book and your approach. Apologetics was basically, Christianity is true. Here's why. You're wrong. Deal with it, right? And that maybe that appealed to the masculine part of me, right? But the air we breathe, I think, represents a different and perhaps growing approach to apologetics. Not necessarily that Christianity is true, although I'm sure you believe that it is, but that the things we value most are incomprehensible without it. So I wonder kind of if the truth-seeking purists of old school apologetics would see this as kind of cutting corners, But then again, it wasn't the cosmological argument that persuaded Richard Dawkins to call himself a cultural Christian. It was the kind of stuff that you're talking about, right? So where do you situate the kinds of arguments that you're making in the air we breathe within that kind of broader category of Christian apologetics?
In one sense, it's kind of historical presuppositional apologetics, in a sense. And I didn't set out to do that. And, I've got a lot of time for presuppositional apologetics. It's not kind of the only thing that I do if I'm debating an atheist, but I've got a lot of time for transcendental arguments for God's existence, and I've got a lot of time for the whole approach that just says there is no neutrality. We're all starting from somewhere. I'm going to name my priors from the outset, and I think probably you, my non-Christian friend, have priors that you are not entitled to on naturalism, and that we're probably more familiar with the presuppositionalism of apologetics in that realm. But I think the more that I started to pull at the thread of the historical impact of Christianity, the more I sort of thought, yeah, this is exactly like the presuppositional type stuff. And one of the ways it's like presuppositional stuff is that you become annoying, just like a good presuppositional apologist. And I say that as somebody who
upon
very happily,
what basis?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, by what standard, right? And this is what you end up doing actually when you use the air we breathe kind of argument, because the non-Christian will kind of say, no, how dare you say that I'm Christian? I'm not unequal, bigoted, cruel, coercive like those Christians are. And you end up saying, well, by what standard do you think that you're meant to be, equal and compassionate and consensual, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it does sort of fit into that kind of paradigm of just instead of giving you a syllogism, I'm kind of asking you, I'm narrating your world to you and saying, look around. This is what you value, isn't it? And I'm hoping that the non-Christian goes, yeah, it kind of is what I value. And then I say, now look at your feet. What are you standing on? What enables you to have the values that you already prize? So I think it fits into that kind of apologetic.
Yeah, I remember one time I had an extended argument in my early 20s with an atheist, and I persuaded him that on his own worldview, the Holocaust wasn't wrong. And he said, well, I guess the Holocaust wasn't wrong then. And I said, no, that's not what I was trying to get you to.
Yeah. It's dangerous stuff, eh?
It is, yeah. Something you said made me think of a line from Doug Wilson, who's I find problematic for so many reasons, but occasionally has some really great one-liners. But in his sort of defense of presuppositional apologetics, he said that the atheist sort of gets into the Christian car to drive it into the tree, and
right.
That's sort of essentially what's going on, right? That you're saying I want to use Christianity, we'll stand on Christianity, and then try to argue that what I'm standing on isn't there.
Yeah. You saw the branch that you're sitting on. You saw off the branch of the tree that you're sitting on. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, so one of my favorite sentences in the book is the problem with power to the people is people. And, libertarians tend to distrust democracy, but also all governments for this reason, arguing that power should not actually be democratized, but really decentralized to the lowest level of society, which is the individual. So I wondered, would you see that as a good solution to that problem with the power of the people is people thing? Or do you see would you appeal to some other practical solution for that problem?
Yeah, the problem is individuals too. Mm-hmm. And the problem can be individualism too. And so, yeah, I'm very happy that Christianity has invented the individual. I think as we look as Westerners to the culture that we have kind of inherited in 2025, we cannot fail but to see how individualistic we are. And in a sense, you can see the way that Christianity has invented the individual, but we've become individualistic. It's invented rights, but instead of us using rights as a shield against the many, we kind of now use it as a sword against all. And instead of simply prizing rights, we kind of simply prize the rights and fail to attend to any of our responsibilities or obligations or things like that. So I think libertarianism is a very decent political philosophy that has a venerable history to it and some very Christian presuppositions to it. My worry with it is just that it conceives of the person too narrowly, and it has the tendency to forget my obligations to the broader society and the fact that I'm woven into a broader social fabric. But I much prefer it to many different political philosophies. But I do think the individual can end up being atomized, and I think there are some scriptural kind of tendencies that might want us to ameliorate that individualism and that atomization and have a broader social theory.
Yeah, well, I sense maybe some tiptoeing there because you're on the Libertarian Christian podcast. But if you don't you don't have to try to be sensitive to that. But that's fine. No, I understand what you're saying. I think I would distinguish political individualism from a kind of ontological individualism. And
yep.
I think sometimes libertarians have a tendency to confuse those two things. And so that is definitely a problem. But I think the one thing that I value about what Libertarian Christian Institute does is we add Christianity to that mix. And so it's not just a political philosophy about limiting the power of the state and allowing the individuals to make their own decisions, but also an ethic about what community is supposed to be and and what our ethical commitments are supposed to be. But
So, I mean, would you, for instance, on something like euthanasia and that kind of thing? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
interestingly, we just had a vote in the UK Parliament about euthanasia, and it kind of split left and right into the more individualistic left wingers went together with the more individualistic right wingers to vote in
Yeah.
favor of euthanasia, whereas the old school leftist sort of socialists were together with the old school conservatives, voting against euthanasia.
Yeah.
Where does the libertarian Christian position come out on that?
Yeah, well, I'd have to pull the Libertarian Christian Institute to check out the sort of the nuances of where my colleagues would land on it. I mean, I'm very suspicious of euthanasia because I think once you connect it to the state, there's additional problems, hazards, and potentials for abuse. Particularly when you have like a socialized government, socialized medicine, that suddenly now there's sort of a pressure to push people down a certain pipeline to kind of get them off the books. I think, from a libertarian perspective, I think there's two things to take into consideration, which is, are people making autonomous decisions in their right mind? But then also, are they, ultimately the other question is, do people have a right to make their own decisions, whether we like them or agree with them or not? And so I think that probably the answers would be somewhat varied. But we would look into, I think we would probably put more stress, or at least pay more attention to, we always tend to go with individual rights as kind of our starting point, unless there's some kind of mitigating factor that's pretty important. And in that case, I think there might be, my inclination is to be very, very suspicious and skeptical of euthanasia, even though, it's like, you could make suicide illegal, but if someone attempts suicide, they shouldn't go to jail for it, right? You know what I mean? Treating it, it gets kind of messy. So, okay, so maybe I'll ask you a sensitive question now, which is in light of, it's pretty sensitive in light of UK politics and things that are going on right now, that Elon Musk has made a major issue on Twitter. And if you'd prefer to not answer it, we can cut it out and just, move on. But so as a libertarian and a Christian in particular, I tend to be supportive of immigration because I think it's a net positive for both immigrants and the societies that they immigrate to, and that giving people the freedom to better themselves and their families is a moral thing to do. However, your book highlights the reality that Western values like equality, compassion, consent, freedom, that they're not actually universal givens. And that suggests that not everyone who comes to the West will necessarily share, appreciate, or respect those values. So the big story that's been dominating social media recently has to do with Pakistani immigrants organizing to abuse young girls in Northern England. And that problem was made worse by the ethic of political correctness that prevented authorities from jumping into action, lest the reputation of the peaceful immigrants be hurt by what the non-peaceful immigrants were doing. And so, as it always does with stories about sexual abuse and corruption, of course, the story does get out. You try to hide it, but it ends up getting out, making it much worse. And so, I think, I would argue that the story is an example of a progressive warping of Christian values, but because they're not actually applying the same equal standard and treating individuals as individuals. I acknowledge that there's a right-wing concern here and that's not totally illegitimate. So that's a long lead up to the question, but the question basically is, in light of what your book has to say about the uniqueness of these Western values that are rooted in Christianity, how should that kind of data inform our immigration policy? Should we be trying to limit it because there's a concern that these people may not share these values that are so important to us?
Well, I think we should hold people to the same standards. We should definitely hold people to, like, don't rape people. I mean, that's a pretty low bar. And I think we really ought to.
Just to jump in, it is low bar, but as you point out, it wasn't low bar in the Roman world.
True. Yeah, true. Which is why I kind of like having a Christian nation, right? And I wouldn't mind saying to immigrants from wherever, like in our society, we do stuff like this. And there should be absolutely no sense in which there is a paralegal system of Sharia law that happens in some communities. To have one society, we need to have one law. And things right down to, like, adoption, for instance. Like we've already spoken a little bit about adoption and orphan care and as this Christian thing, and it is a totally Christian thing. And Islam, there is no such thing as adoption in the way that we think of adoption. They would think that, well, it's a legal fiction to call a child who is not your child your child. You like for a Muslim that's just one example of and you could multiply this by 1,000. There are all sorts of ways that we think of as simply secular, obvious, natural, universal, logical, rational ways of running a society, and actually they're basically Christian-ish assumptions that we have. And I do think that people who want to live in such a society need to be very aware of that and need to be very happy to live by those standards. And I think it's it's the soft bigotry of low expectations to not expect different cultures we ought to expect them to uphold those laws that we prize, but also B, to speak into their communities and to call out such behaviors. What was really concerning for me after the rape gangs scandal was once again broken and once again brought to public attention more recently, is that I just hadn't had the sense of a lot of community leaders from those communities doing soul searching out loud. It's not as though Christians are guiltless in these areas. We can think of all sorts of sexual abuse scandals within the church. It's just that when those happened, the media went knocking on the door of the cardinal and of the archbishop and demanded statements and demanded soul searching. And I think if we don't do that for all communities within our culture, then yeah, there's a real sense in which it's the soft bigotry of low expectations for such cultures, and we ought to, as an expression of our belief in their equality, in their full equality, that we ought to hold them to those standards. Definitely.
Spoken like a true individualist and a true libertarian. I've actually got two quick questions and we'll wrap up. They're from folks who attended our book clubs. I think they're kind of quick. I guess it depends on if you think they're quick, I suppose.
Depends on me.
Okay, so of the three target audiences that the author describes in his introduction, the ones, the dones, and the nuns, which you could elaborate if you want to, how has the book been received in these different groups in the experience of the author? Has he gotten more or less traction or engagement with any of these than when he expected when he wrote the book?
So the ones are those who've been won by the good news of Jesus, i.e. the Christians. And I think the overwhelming positive response that people have to the book is just, oh, I'm actually proud to be a Christian. I'm actually having been told that we're on the wrong side of history the whole time. Isn't it nice to see that, no, we've been shaping history the whole time. So I think that, yeah, giving people a real sense of, I think the gospel is good. I think what Jesus teaches to the world is good news, and I think it's given people a real confidence in their Christianity. In terms of the duns, I've had limited kind of reach into that community. I mean, you've got to really be ready to hear another Christian argument when you're done with Christianity and it's in the rearview mirror and somebody tracks you down and says, "No, but here, read this book." I've had limited reach into those communities, but I do think there's a value in the message to those people. I still think the reasons that you are rejecting Christianity have their grounds in Christ himself, and it's really worth having another look at him. And then with the nuns, the NONESs, those who have no religious affiliation, I think it has been working with such people. I've heard of numbers and numbers of people who are at least giving church a go, because they're basically recognizing the beliefs I already hold are Christian-ish. I need to nourish those beliefs with something properly Christian. Let me go to church. Let me read the scriptures. Let me give myself to this Christian thing and see what happens. And people are becoming Christians via that route, and I praise God for it.
Good answer. Okay, one more for you. The term Judeo-Christian has attracted some negative attention of late from the Christian nationalist types. They don't like the combining of those two things. But when you reflect upon Western values and tradition, would you say that some of it can be contributed to the Judeo part of the Judeo-Christian? And I'll add, I think of a book, Justice for All, How the Jewish Bible Revolutionized Ethics by Jeremiah Unterman, which we argues how those things are rooted in the Jewish part of Judeo-Christian. But your book is largely about the New Testament. Where do you feel the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, comes in this conversation?
The first of the 7 values is based on basically Genesis 1 and the image of God, equality. And you do not get the scriptures without the Hebrew Bible. Judeo-Christian is a kind of a mouthful, and its etymology it's probably only really a post-war phrase. I think what we kind of mean is scripture as it's been fulfilled in Christ. That has been the strongest intellectual tradition that has shaped the West. Does that include the 39 books of the Hebrew Bible? 100% it does. Do there remain Jewish ethical thinkers drawing on that great tradition who can contribute to the West and its philosophy and politics? 100%. That's true, but it has been the Christian revolution that has carried the day, really, and that's the bulk of the book.
Yeah, there's this interesting kind of cycle where the Old Testament, obviously, the Hebrew Bible influences the early church, and then the early church influences the West, and then the West influences a lot of great Jewish thinkers and intellectuals and philosophers, and then they in turn turn around and also shape their culture. So there is kind of a cycle that goes on there. But okay, so Glenn, I really want to thank you for making the time to talk with us at the Libertarian Christian Institute. For those who weren't part of the November LCI book club or who otherwise haven't read it yet, the book is called The Air We Breathe, and we at LCI highly recommend it. So thank you, Glenn.
Hey, thanks so much, Cody.
Appreciate it.